I'm talking today about the evolution of what women want. The question of what women want has perplexed men forever. And there is no answer because it varies from woman to woman and from hour to hour. But there is a pattern to how what women want has evolved over time. And that's what I'd like to tackle today. Most of us agree with Darwin that we evolved from monkeys, and monkeys themselves evolved 20 or 30 million years ago. So let's start there. What do monkeys want? Monkey women, monkey men. They all want food, which is pretty easy. They grab ripe fruit out of the trees and eat it. They also want security, and the males provide more of the security, baring their fierce canine teeth to scare the leopards and other predators away. And the females do their role of taking care of the young, raising the young monkeys to be grown-up monkeys. And they all engage in a lot of sex to make more monkeys. You have only to go to the zoo to verify this. Monkeys evolved into great apes, chimpanzees, our ancestors, from whom we split 7 million years ago. A little change there. Chimpanzees have a little bit of an appetite for meat. They will kill other animals when they can and eat them. They also have a little bit of an appetite for killing one another. Shocked the primatologists when they found out, but it's true that males from one tribe will kill the males from another tribe and take over the females if they can do it. But they're still mostly vegetarians. As I say, we split from the chimpanzees 7 million years ago. Halfway through that period was Lucy, whose fossil remains were found in the middle of Africa. Lucy had already learned how to walk upright. Her hands were free. And she used those hands to dig out roots, still grab fruits, find edible bugs, anything she could. And of course, to take care of babies. Babies were vitally important then, as they were for the monkeys. Now, Lucy's mate used these things, these hands, which grew to have opposable thumbs, to pick up sticks, throw rocks, to keep away predators and to get some meat. They had more of an appetite for meat, and it seems that the males were more responsible than the females for gathering the meat. 2 million years ago, we started to use fire, and we started chipping stones to make better tools. Well, you don't need sharp stones to cut fruit, but they're useful for cutting up meat. And more meat became part of our diet, so it appears. Then 150,000 years ago, a little calculation here, that's about 2% of the time since we split from the chimpanzees, we evolved speech. There was a little population of Homo sapiens in the heart of Africa evolved the ability to speak, and things took off because a mother, human being, was able to ask for help. She'd ask for her mother, her sister, her teenage daughters, and even the men to help. This had a vastly important effect because a human mom was able to have a baby every 2 years instead of every 6 years, as it was for mama apes. And our numbers expanded from 10 or 20,000 in the heart of Africa. We expanded all over Africa and then all over the world. Speech was a very useful innovation. Among other things, our ancestors, us Europeans, went up through the Holy Land, up into the cold heart of Asia, where we started to hunt mammoths and other big things. And we hunted all winter. When the woman couldn't gather fruits, tubers, bugs, and other stuff, they depended on men for meat. But we, of course, depended on the women as well for making our warm clothes, which we now needed, keeping our mammoth bone huts warm, and for keeping the babies warm and fed. So the specialization of the sexes increased over time, and it made us more successful. All the while, we had a keen sense of us and them, our tribe and the enemies. Our tribe was the people we knew and could number, less than the Dunbar number of 150, way less in most cases. And everybody else was the enemy, and you stayed away from them. And within our tribe, swapping mates was kind of common, so we assume. It's still common in tribal Africans, the American Indians, the Kayapo, with whom I spent some time, and Eskimos, because it really didn't matter whose father was whose, because they were all second cousins anyhow, and there wasn't anything to be gained by saying, this guy is that guy's father. It was all one tribe. The tribe was what mattered. So they swapped partners rather easily. The key thing was having babies. But then with agriculture, things started to change, because we learned how to stay put. As anybody who has owned a house knows, once you start staying put, you accumulate stuff. So we accumulated a lot of stuff. We could grow our food by staying put, gathering at the same place every year, trading it with other people for stuff, like ornaments for the ladies, or better rocks to make stone tools or whatever. And this trading put us in touch with strangers. Now, we had been trading for several millennia, many millennia prior, but our trading became more serious once we had food, stored wealth to swap. And this led to a couple of changes. First of all, now we had stuff. It kind of mattered who's going to get your stuff when you die. So whose kid is mine starts to matter. And the other thing that mattered was we had all these strangers coming through, these traders and so on, and while you might not care if your women are cavorting with your brother or your cousin, you do care if your women are diluting the bloodstream by carrying on with strangers. So you start to care, who is that guy? And the patriarchy was born, whereby women's sexuality was controlled. They were pretty much limited to one man. In the agricultural system, first time in our evolutionary history. Here was the deal. You are faithful to that one guy, and that nice guy gives you nice stuff. Now that we have stuff. And women got very good at saying, honey, please, can I have some stuff? And they got the ornaments, and they got the nice clothes, the nice animal skins and this and that. And the patriarchy worked. Our numbers expanded. We had, backing up the patriarchy, the concept of religion. Tribe, which became increasingly less important, clan and family, and religion told us, be fruitful and multiply, have more babies. Or if you were Northeast Asian, it said, honor your ancestors, have some babies. And, or it is Allah's will, you will have babies. Whatever, having babies was a big part of the thing, and the specialization of the sexes continued. The men continued digging the earth, hunting, herding animals, whatever, and women took care of the hearth and fire and the babies. And they also maintained social relations. And this was women's status. A woman's status in life under agriculture, more than even before, depended on her husband. Now she had one husband, and depended on how good of a mother she was, how many children she had, how successful she was in raising those children to be just like the others in the tribe. And women also had a social role. As much as men, the women socialized and they kind of reinforced the unity of the tribe. Women had wants. What women want was always important, but what they wanted was social goods. They wanted a nice house so they could entertain, so they could raise their families. They wanted warm clothes, and they wanted ornamental stuff such as a tea set to entertain the vicar when he came to tea or whatever else. But they wanted nice things mainly to show their status. In the period of agriculture, the past 10,000 years, we have had calmer sexual urges. Because in the olden days, the sexual partner swapping days, you had to be a little bit aggressive to get a sex partner when you wanted one. But under agriculture, we're more and more monogamous, so it was kind of a granted who you were going to have sex with. Same old person, time after time, yep. Which decreased infighting among the men, which was good. And it meant that men and women had more effort to dedicate to educating the children, which became more and more of a task because there was more to learn. So our sexual desires, our libido decreased as we put more investment in other things, such as raising the kids. And there was a little bit more sexual equality. There was, particularly among us Indo-Europeans, there was inequality that came with monogamy and respect for women that came with making lifetime partnerships. We had to choose carefully, as did the women, and rely on those lifetime partners. Then came the Enlightenment. We were quite rich, and Europeans dominated more and more of the world. With our voyages of discovery, we came to dominate 70, 80, 90% of the land area of the earth, most of the populations. We asked the question what God wanted. Now, we viewed God as an increasingly distant deity who had set things in motion at the beginning of time and was kind of content to sit back and watch instead of telling us day to day how to live our lives. Meanwhile, women had become quite more equal. They were sitting at the table with the kings, the mistresses of France, Madame du Barry, Madame Pompadour, and their opinions were being heard. The wives of the second and fourth presidents of the United States, Abigail Adams and Dolly Madison, were extremely influential with the whole circle of government in the United States. They were being heard. Now, women were increasingly free to make their own decisions. This hadn't happened throughout evolutionary history. The men had always kind of made the decisions, and it had become more and more so in the patriarchy. And now all of a sudden, we had evolved to the point where women's opinions were being heard. They were being allowed to make up their own minds, and they didn't have much experience with it. So whereas previously in a tribal society, in an agrarian society, they would listen to advice from grandma and listen to advice from the matchmaker and everybody else, get married, and that was it. That was what you did with your life. Now they had a lot more freedom, and they did not have the evolutionary experience of making their decisions, and they had evolved to be emotional, to make their decisions emotionally more than rationally. Excuse me, this is an unfair thing to say, but I think it's generally agreed. They made their decisions emotionally, and now they were free to make their decisions. This accelerated with the Industrial Revolution. The cities were now safe for women, more safer with policemen on the corner, and they could get around town by walking or by taking a horse-drawn tram or some other transport, so they could go to jobs, and they started working for salary. And they could go everybody could travel longer distances more safely because there were trains and steamships. So women's life changed, and they competed more and more in the sectors that had been traditionally male. They had their personal wants started to emerge, and there were things to want. In the 19th century, there was photography, phonographs, fashion emerged. Cheap calicos that the English developed could be made into a new fashion every year. So for the first time in human history, it was no longer, I need a new dress because the old one is worn out. No, I need a new dress because I want a new dress. I want something that's this year's fashion. Vacations came in. Now that people were working for a salary, they had stipulated time off, and they could travel with those trains and steamships and so on. So personal desires as far as amusements came in. 20th century brought more of the same. You had movies, you had nightclubs, you had places, restaurants, places to go, things to do. There are so many things to want, and you had something new. Advertisers to tell you what you wanted. The father of advertising, Albert Bernays, nephew of Sigmund Freud, created one of the first great ad campaigns for women. The Freedom Torch. Women, assert your rights, show your independence, smoke, and show the men that you're just as good as a man. And it certainly worked. Women started smoking in droves. Didn't do them a great deal of good, but there they went. And advertising created all sorts of wants we didn't know we had. Do you have halitosis, bad breath? Oh, you need this mouthwash, you need this toothpaste. Do you have body odor? The men might not like you. Ooh, put something under there for body odor. I assure you that we men are seldom repelled by body odor if you take a bath every now and again. But that's beside the point. All of these imaginary needs were ginned up, and women who came to control most of the spending were obvious targets for this advertising. Entertainment gave us messages in addition to advertising. Here's 4 that I know from my limited watching of television. Three's Company in the 1970s had some scantily clad babes living in an apartment with a guy who pretended he was gay in order to get cheap rent. But gay became fashionable starting in the 1970s, and it was promoted by entertainment. Then came Murphy Brown a little later, a single woman raising a child. Once again, telling women how to live. You don't need a guy, you can raise a child all by yourself. And keyed by what they saw on TV, a lot of women did that. Then came Friends, a bunch of 20 and 30-somethings casually living their lives without any thought much to marriage. I think there was a marriage that didn't last very long on Friends, but it was mostly just getting along and occasionally swapping partners and this and that, and talking about it with no commitment to having kids for the perpetuation of society. That was an old thought. The last one I mentioned, Sex and the City, didn't last all that long. It was about women being aggressively sexual, pursuing what they wanted the same way men did. Well, it turned out that women aren't like that. Actually, no female mammal is like that. And that show didn't last all that long. But the idea was that women, you do it on yourself. You don't depend on the men for anything. Social messages coming out of this: women don't owe society anything. And more than that, being just a mom. Only raising children is hardly a worthwhile way to spend your life. Aren't you doing anything, lady? What about your desires? What about your self-fulfillment? So individual came to fruition, and women were told that having kids just wasn't a cool thing to do. What women wanted had changed from the social to the personal. They wanted tangible things, tangible enjoyments, and they didn't want the social goods of being respected as a good wife and mother and a good keystone of society. And they came to the point to think that men are superfluous. Do we need them? Nah, what for? Money? We've got our own. We don't mind taking a little bit when we get divorced. In fact, they'll take as much as they can get when they get divorced. But they don't need a man for money. They need a man for sex. Sex is easy. Hey, you want to have sex? Yes. Sex is easily available to women, and besides that, as previously mentioned, their libidos have been diminished since chimpanzee days, and they don't really need all that much in the first place. Do you need a man as a father? Well, that assumes you want kids. If you don't want kids, you surely don't want a man to be a father. Men are superfluous.
This is a minute of talking about things that you're not allowed to talk about, so let's just pretend I didn't talk about them. This is excised from the video. If you want to hear what I had to say, you can look elsewhere on the internet to find it.
So we don't go to restaurants. Restaurants are a hassle. So basically, we're not doing as much as we used to. So there are changes in what women want. I'm going to go into them. The changes in necessities, security, jobs, and status. The government promises are increasingly turning out to be hollow. They promise us health care. But the health care in nationalized systems like Great Britain, Australia, Canada is getting terrible. Longer waits, less service, and
Not allowed to say this, so just pretend that it wasn't said, or look elsewhere.
pensions are getting worse. They make you wait longer and longer before you can collect it, and they allow inflation to eat it away, so you get less and less when you finally do. And that's for people who are reaching pension age. You young people in my audience, you're out of luck and you increasingly know it. There are a lot of welfare clients who depend on the government continuing to print out money all the time and hand it out, but they are losing their ability to print because inflation is eating away. People are not buying government bonds. People just don't trust the government much anymore. And those welfare clients who have lived for 2, 3, 4 generations on the generosity of the taxpayers are finding there are fewer taxpayers and the government simply don't have the money to pass out. It's going to be a hard day of reckoning when the money totally runs out. It's not going to be pretty in countries that have large welfare rolls. Lastly, government's promises of safety in government are simply going away. With large numbers of immigrants and underclass, there's more and more crime, and the government is unable to pay for safety. And by the way, we have gotten so nice that we coddle the criminals, and even if we wanted to do something, the bien-pensants among us won't let us do it. Security is down. So this is security in your old age. because there just aren't taxpayers to pay your pensions. I'm lucky I'm old enough that I got mine, but you may not have yours. And on the other hand, if you have kids, they will find work because the same dynamic works there. There are so few kids being born today that there will be a lot for them to do. Among other things, there'll be a lot of old people you guys take care of, and there won't be too many people who are able to do the work, particularly if it takes brains, because who's being born is being born not of people like you in my audience for the most part, but the lower classes who aren't quite as smart as we are. Am I allowed to say that? In employment, men's work is going to come back into fashion. Men put food on the table. Men farm and do things. Women largely populate the caring professions such as nursing, diversity experts, teaching, and so on. But we're not having kids, so many kids, we don't need the teachers, and we don't really need all the diversity. When push comes to shove and things get tight, we'll discover there's stuff we can live without. Women will come up with a question of, this is addressing what women want, what are you going to spend your money on? What do you want? Because you don't want stuff that you're used to, the cruises, travel, cars, you got Uber and Lyft and so on. It may be that having kids isn't such a sacrifice because there's no other places to put the money. Media may change their message. They have run out of taboos almost. Well, there's a couple left. Incest and bestiality haven't been really worked by television, but the rest of them have. And it may come back to the 1950s, Leave It to Beaver, Ozzie and Harriet, where TV again portrays mom and dad and three kids as a good thing. Who knows? The elite's propaganda is failing right and left. We're laughing at their climate dictates. Global warming? No, we don't see it. That's made up just to scare us into compliance. The New World Order is folding in real time right in front of our eyes. At the same time, budgets are collapsing. These fantastic magic money tree budgets where they continue to print money trillion after trillion has to come to an end, and it is starting to fold. We're seeing inflation, as it always does, take off, and there's less and less money to go around because the money that they pass out is like Confederate dollars. It's increasingly worthless. What we're seeing is self-reliance is emerging, re-emerging. People can't depend on the government for their pensions. They can't depend on big agriculture to feed you because they use a lot of pesticides and so on in the food, and they can't get it to you. People are becoming dependent, are becoming more self-reliant. They're building their own home gardens. We are learning to take care of ourselves. And we are trading. We don't trust government money anymore, and we are learning to barter. We are feverishly investigating things like gold and Bitcoin and other things that can't lose their value. We haven't figured out yet quite how to do it, but there are many great minds working on it. Now let's go back to who has kids. We just went through who is not having kids. The woke women are saying we have better things to do than have kids. But these woke women who aren't having kids will, die out, just like the Shaker religious sect that didn't have kids. In fact, something that goes hand in hand with being woke is there's a whole class of people who are dependent on welfare. These are people who have been collecting taxpayer money for their support for 1 or 2 generations. And all of a sudden that money from the government is inflated away to have no value. Big agriculture is no longer able to put food on the table because they're worried about cows putting methane in the air and whatever else. So the food's not going to be there. And the underclass, which depends on government, is going to find no government there, and they don't know how to take care of themselves. They are not self-reliant. So they will probably disappear. So to go back to the question of who has kids, it'll be a very few who retain their fertility throughout all this madness. Fertility is hereditary. People from large families generally want large families. And there are people who are religious tend to have large families. Religion is also hereditary. So political conservatism is hereditary. So the few of us, the red state folks and so on, who have been having kids will continue to have kids. And what we're going to find is that there's a lot for our kids to do because there aren't that many kids. Other people don't want them, have been scared out of having them, have been told that they don't want them, or if one reason and another, the relatively few children of the self-sufficient people of our generation who want kids are going to find themselves in a pretty good position. The world will need smart people like our kids in the coming generation. So this raises a question. Talking about what women want, you ladies who are listening to this, what do you want? Will you want children? Will you want to carry on your bloodline, your culture? And in particular, will you be encouraged to do so, knowing that your kids are really the future of humanity? There's an evolutionary bottleneck taking place right now, more severe probably than the Black Death. Are your kids going to slip through that bottleneck? That's the question. What do you ladies want?